Hello guys, it's Bella and welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another Mystery Monday, although I'm not sure we could call this one mystery because it's my first solved case I'm doing here on this channel. I have had so many requests from you guys to do a solved case, so I found a really interesting one and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get into it, I do want to mention that this video is sponsored by Audible. I'm sure you guys have heard of them, but if you haven't, it is basically a website where you can go and listen to different audiobooks. It is great. I always listen to them like when I'm in the car or when I'm like walking Mia, even when I'm in the shower sometimes. They're so interesting and they have literally every genre under the sun, you know, like romance, comedy, crime. I've been listening to one recently which I'm actually doing a Mystery Monday about, so stay tuned. It is literally the most interesting case that I have ever done, and it's about the Ken and Barbie killers. It's called like Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, the truth behind the Ken and Barbie killers. It is so incredibly interesting, and if you guys do want to listen to that book or anything else on Audible, you can go to www.audible.com/BellaFiore, or you can text Bella Fiore to 500 500 and you will get a 30-day free trial and a free book of your choice to listen to. So I will leave all of that information down below. Make sure you check it out and let's go ahead and get into today's case. So today we are going to be talking about the case of Jacob Wetterling, and this is hands down the most heartbreaking case that I've looked into. And I don't know if it's because it's solved, so we know all of the details, that makes it that much more sad. So Jacob Wetterling was born on the 17th of February in 1978 in St. Joseph's, Minnesota. His parents, Patty and Jerry, also had 3 other children, Carmen, Amy, and Trevor. St. Joseph's was a tiny little town. There was like 2,500 people that lived there, and it was considered relatively safe. So kids rode their bikes around. At the time, the police chief didn't even carry a gun around with him. And where the Wetterlings lived, so they lived kind of on the outskirts of this small town, so it was, you know, long driveways, dirt roads, the neighbors kind of spread apart, and they lived on like a cul-de-sac, so it was, you know, surrounded by cornfields, bushes, trees, that kind of thing, just to give you a bit of an idea. Growing up, Jacob just seemed like the sweetest little boy. He was in the 6th grade, he loved watching football, he played hockey, he played basketball, and yeah, he just seemed like a really sweet kid.
Today, October 12th, I'm 5 feet tall. My whole name is Jacob Irvin Wetterling. My favorite food is steak. My favorite color is blue. My favorite thing to do most is watch football.
So the day pretty much was like any normal day, which seems to pretty much be how these things always go. They woke up in the morning and Jacob and his dad went fishing, and Jacob loved to go fishing with his dad, so it was a really good start to the day. They came home in time to watch the Vikings versus the Detroit Lions football match, and then after that they went indoor ice skating. So it didn't even just seem like a normal day, it seemed like they were just having a really good day. So Patty and Jerry had a like dinner thing on with some friends that night, so they left for that at around 5:30, and that was about 25 miles away, which is about 32 kilometers and about 25 minutes away from the Wetterlings' house. They weren't planning on being out late at all, so they let the kids stay home by themselves, except for Amy, the eldest daughter. She was out at a friend's house that night because they didn't have any school the next day, so it was just Carmen, the youngest sister, who was 8, Trevor, who was 10, and then Jacob, who was 11, and they also let Jacob have his friend Aaron over, who was also 11, for the night because, like I said, they didn't have school the next day. The 3 boys were kind of just chilling at home, eating some pizza, but then they decided that they wanted to rent a movie, and there was a local Tom Thumb not too far away from the house. I think it was like a 15-minute bike ride, so they had movies there, and they called up their mum and they were like, hey, can we please, you know, ride down to Tom Thumb and go get a movie? And she said no, absolutely not. So Trevor was like, hey, let me talk to dad. You know the old, if mum says no, just ask dad kind of thing. So Trevor was like, let me speak to dad. They spoke to dad and Jerry said, yeah, you guys can go as long as you bring a flashlight with you and wear a reflective vest, because he was just worried about, you know, a car not seeing them or something like that. And honestly, I have to say that was probably one of the most heartbreaking details about this entire case to me, is just thinking about how he must have felt that he like overruled Patty and said that they could go. Of course, they didn't want to leave Carmen at home alone. She was only 8 years old. So they had a next door neighbor who was 14 called Rochelle, and they just asked if she could look after Carmen while they were gone, which she did. So Jacob grabbed a torch, he grabbed a reflective vest, and then they headed out on their bikes. It was about a 15-minute bike ride to Tom Thumb, like I said. And on the way there, they heard some rustling in the cornfields or the long grass, but they didn't really think too much of it. They were like, it's probably just an animal or some wind or something. So they just kept riding. They got to Tom Thumb, hired out the movie The Naked Gun, and then headed home. And it was really dark by the time that they were riding home. So once they got closer to Jacob's house, all of the lights from the town started fading, and they lived in a rural area, so there was no lights. The only light was the light of Jacob's flashlight. And there was this long gravel driveway really close to their house. I'm talking 2 to 3 minutes away from the Wetterling's house, but at this gravel driveway they got stopped by a man who was walking towards them. He had a black mask on and he was wearing all black, and he said, "I have a gun," and to put their bikes into the ditch and then to get in a ditch themselves and lie face down. At first they thought it was some older kids, having a prank on them or something. But then he asked Trevor how old he was, and Trevor replied, he said he was 10 years old, and then he said, "Get up, run away into the bushes, and do not look back. And if you don't run as fast as you can, and if you look back, I will shoot you." The man then asked Jacob and Aaron to stand up, and then he asked Aaron how old he was, and Aaron said he was 11, and then he asked Jacob how old he was, and he was groping Jacob at this point and fondling Jacob, and he asked Jacob how old he was, and Jacob said he was 11, and then he told Aaron the same thing as Trevor. He said, "Run into the woods as fast as you can, and if you look back, I will shoot you." So Aaron ran off as fast as he could, and he ran so fast that he caught up to Trevor, and once he caught up to Trevor, they both looked back, and by the time they looked back, both Jacob and the man were gone, and they couldn't see anything, and they had no idea where he went, and this was about 9:20 p.m, and this was the last time Jacob was ever seen alive. When Trevor and Aaron got back to their house and Rochelle was there, they were just yelling. They were saying, "Someone took Jacob, Jacob's gone." Rochelle had no idea what to do, so she went next door to tell her dad, Merle Jerzak, who immediately called Patty and Jerry. He said, "You need to get home immediately. I don't know what's happened, but Jacob is gone. Someone has taken Jacob." And then after he got off the phone with them, he immediately called 911 and was trying to explain what happened, but obviously he wasn't there. So he put Trevor on, who explained what happened. He said that this guy had a raspy voice and that he was short and stocky.
Yes, this is Merlin Jerzak calling from in St. Joe, out in the township. I'm right now next door to my neighbors, the Jerry Wetterling family.
That's where you're calling.
And some of their boys went down to Tom Thumb's to pick up a movie, and on their way back, someone stopped them, and we believe that they have one of the boys because one of the boys did not come back with them.
So were they picked up in a vehicle?
Just a second, I'll ask for it. Was there a vehicle there, or was he walking? They didn't see a vehicle. This person appeared on the road when they were bicycling back home.
Okay, what was Jacob last seen wearing?
He was wearing a red hockey jacket that had police department on it.
Hello, Trevor? You're talking to the sheriff's office, okay? I want you to give me anything you can recall about this male party that approached you guys, okay?
Well, he was like a man.
He was large?
Sort of.
Okay.
He had his lips had nylon things as a mask.
Do you know what color it was?
Black.
A black mask? Do you know what color jacket he had on?
It was black too.
I have a deep voice, anything like that you can remember?
Yes, I can.
Trevor,
pretty cold for me.
see any weapons at all or anything like that? Guns and knives?
He had a pistol.
So when officers first arrived at the Wetterling house, and this is the most crucial time, might I remind you guys, in any missing persons case, the first thing that any officer does is the most important thing, and it really is like make or break for a case. But when they first got to the Wetterlings' house, they were questioning Trevor and Aaron, and they did not believe that they were telling the truth. They didn't believe that Jacob was abducted. They thought that maybe, you know, Trevor and Aaron were playing with a gun and they accidentally shot Jacob and were trying to cover it up. Or they thought that Jacob had run away and that they were trying to cover it up for long enough that Jacob could get far enough away. It wasn't until about 10:45, so about 90 minutes after Jacob was abducted, that they had started their search. It was a big search, mind you, and this wasn't even the biggest search of the case. This turned into a massive case, but we'll get into that later. At this time, at 10:45, they had firefighters, they had volunteers, they had law enforcement officers, and they even had helicopters out looking for Jacob. And the only thing that they found were footprints and tire tracks near the long gravel driveway where Jacob was abducted. And weirdly enough, they actually didn't ask any of the neighbors any questions, not even the guy at the end of the long driveway, who was Dan Rassier. He was an elementary school music teacher in St. Joseph's. They didn't ask this guy any questions. They did speak to this guy, but they didn't seek him out. So what happened was, about 9 p.m, Dan was home alone and he heard his dog Smokey barking. So he looked out the window and he saw someone driving down, well, he saw headlights driving down his driveway. They then turned around and left his driveway. And he didn't really think too much of it. He just kind of went to bed. But then later, he was woken up by Smokey barking again. So he looked out his window and he saw all of these men with flashlights looking around his wood pile, which he thought that they were just like people trying to steal his firewood. So he went outside to go and confront them. But there was quite a few of them. So he got a little bit spooked, went back inside and called 911. And 911 told them that they were just police officers and there was a search going on. So he actually went out to talk to them and offered to help. They didn't question him though. He offered to help look around the like farms and stuff like that. Not the farms, but the like farm buildings like on his property. The next day, the people of St. Joseph's started to find out, and everybody wanted to pitch in and help. You know, it was a small community, and this abduction really like shook the community. So they also started to get some media coverage, and it became this massive thing, like a massive case. The Wetterlings constantly had people at their house, like so many people always at their house wanting to help out. They had so many leads, and it was crazy. They had hundreds of officers working this case, police from all around Minnesota, FBI. At one point in the week following the disappearance, there was thousands of people that made a human chain down the main road. Again, they were still searching for him. They were using bloodhounds, helicopters, ATVs in the more rural areas. They had thousands of volunteers and even police on horseback, all looking for Jacob, but again, they didn't find anything. The Wetterlings did interviews almost every single day to get more leads and to keep Jacob's name out there, and it worked with the leads. They had hundreds of leads. I read something that was like by 2016, they had about 70,000 leads on this case, and police were following up every single one. This was huge. This case was massive, and it was one of the biggest searches for a single missing child in United States history. But they still didn't find anything, and they didn't for a very long time. They didn't really have any suspects or persons of interest either. They did have one that they were kind of looking into, but yeah, nothing really came of it, and they let him go almost immediately. It wasn't until 2004 that police finally named a real person of interest, and this was Dan Rassier. I talked about him before. He was the man that lived at the end of the long gravel driveway where Jacob was abducted. In 2002, a man named John Sanner was elected the Stearns County Sheriff, and he vowed to do his hardest to solve this case. And he and his team, in doing that, came up with their own theory, which the main person of interest was Dan. For 14 years until John was elected, they were working under the assumption that whoever had abducted Jacob had done so using a vehicle, especially considering, you know, the car that Dan had saw come down his driveway. But in 2004, John and his team came up with a new theory, and this theory basically was that whoever abducted Jacob did so on foot, which basically meant that the abductor had to have been close by, and therefore they suspected Dan. And it also meant that the car that Dan saw had absolutely nothing to do with it. So this entire theory came about because of a guy named Kevin and Kevin's girlfriend. So basically on the night of the abduction, they were listening to a police scanner, which anyone can do. You or I could do it. It's not, something that was sneaky or anything. Basically, they heard on the police scanner about what was happening. They heard about Jacob and they decided to go and check it out for themselves. And they went down and they didn't see anything. So they went down the driveway, did a U-turn, saw the bikes, and they were going to pick up the bikes, but then, they decided against it. And when they were leaving, they saw a policeman parked in a car park, and they went into the car park and they told the policeman about it, and he just didn't want to have a bar of it. He didn't care. So this kind of became a story that Kevin told at parties. It was kind of like his icebreaker. And in 2003, he told this story to someone who happened to be a federal marshal. This marshal urged him to go and tell law enforcement about this, which he did do, and that immediately explained away both the car that Dan saw and the tire marks that were found. So that's how the whole theory came about, that there was no car involved at all. And that is when investigators decided that Dan Rassier was their guy. From this point on, they basically just spent their time trying to prove that Dan was their guy and build a case against him until the 30th of June in 2010, when investigators from the Stearns County Sheriff's Office, FBI agents, and even officers from the State Crime Bureau, I don't know how to say that word, but all of them came to search his house, and the search lasted 2 days, and they even excavated a part at the back of his property where he and his family often dumped ashes from their wood burnings. And this was all over the news. This had so much coverage. There was helicopters literally watching the entire search of his house, and this meant that Dan's face was plastered everywhere. His life was essentially ruined by this because his face was everywhere as the main suspect of the person who abducted Jacob Wetterling. And he was treated this way for about 15 years. He was treated horribly. And not only was he treated horribly, but so were his parents. He lived with his parents at the time. He made several complaints and wrote several complaints about how he was treated, and nothing was ever done. It was really sad, and especially looking back on it, considering that this case is now solved, it's just so incredibly sad. He was always so incredibly helpful to them and was always helping, officers, and always trying to look for Jacob, and his whole life was ruined, basically. He, I think, sued the Stearns County Sheriff's Office. I'm not entirely sure, but, I'm not sure what's happening with that, but yeah, very sad. On the 28th of October in 2015, police finally came up with a new suspect, a new person of interest, and his name was Danny Heinrich. He was actually the first person of interest in this case. He was questioned way back when it happened, but nothing really came of it, and he was let go. So basically what happened was Danny was linked to, via DNA evidence, to another abduction in the same area, very similar to Jacob's, of a boy named Jared Sherl, through DNA evidence that they found on Jared's sweater. So Jared Sherl was he currently is an adult, but at the time of his abduction and at the time of Jacob's abduction, he was a 12-year-old boy. He was abducted on the 13th of January in 1989, just 9 months before Jacob was abducted. And this happened in Cold Spring, which was really, really close to where the Wetterlings live. So the night of Jared's abduction, him and his friends went ice skating together, and then afterwards they went to a little cafe called the Side Cafe together, and then him and his friend Corey walked home together, although they didn't live together. So eventually they had to part ways, and Jared had to walk home alone, which is when a man pulled up beside him in a blue car and asked him for directions. The man then got out of the car and he told Jared Jared to get in the car and that he had a gun and he wasn't afraid to use it. So Jared started walking towards the car, which is when the man told him to get in the back seat and to lie face down in the back seat. He told Jared to put a hat over his head, and Jared said that he was listening to some type of walkie-talkie, which turned out to be a police scanner like the one that I was talking about before that Kevin had. The man drove for about 10 to 15 minutes, and Jared was kind of trying to keep track of where he went, but once they got over these train tracks, he had no idea, and then eventually he drove onto a gravel road, and then he stopped. He got out of the car and he got into the back seat with Jared and sexually assaulted him. He then drove Jared back to town and dropped him about 2 minutes away from his house and said the same thing that he did to Trevor and Aaron. He said, "Run away as fast as you can and don't look back or I will shoot you." He said if anybody got close to finding out who he was, or if anybody came looking for him, that he would find Jared and that he would kill him. So this was a super similar case to Jacob, Aaron, and Trevor. And just like in Jacob's case, Heinrich was a person of interest at the very start of the case. So police questioned him and he gave them a sample of his hair, he gave them his shoes, and he even let them take his tires. He was super cooperative, and they tested his tires and they tested his footprints to the ones at the gravel driveway, and while they were close they said that it wasn't a sure thing. They watched him for weeks, and they actually got a search warrant for his father's house, which is where he was staying at the time of the abductions, and they found black boots, they found camo pants, they found like the police scanners, and they found several locked trunks. Inside of the trunks, they found 2 photos which looked like home photos that he had taken, and they found one of a boy in his underwear and one of a boy in a towel coming out of a shower. But he insisted that it wasn't what it looked like, so they let him keep the photos, which he ended up later burning. And again, they didn't charge him and they just let him go. So as I said, it wasn't until 2015 that he was definitively connected to Jared's crime, first of all. So how this all came about was Jared, actually, he kind of solved his own and Jacob's cases. So he ended up moving to Painesville, and he heard about a string of sexual assaults that had occurred in Painesville and kind of connected the dots in his head that maybe his case, Jacob's case, and these assaults in Painesville were all connected. So he started trying to get in contact with the boys that had been sexually assaulted in Painesville, and all of them together got in contact with investigators of Jacob's case. The investigators ended up going back and looking at all of these cases, and they also had a look at Danny Heinrich. Luckily, investigators still had the clothes that Jared was wearing the night he was sexually assaulted, and they still had Danny's hair. So they sent that off for testing to compare them, and it came back and it was a match. And here's the real kicker, is by the time they figured this out, the statute of limitations on Jared's case had expired, so they couldn't charge him for it. I mean, how frustrating is that? Why is there even a statute of limitations? Although, luckily, because of this DNA match, they did have enough evidence to go and search his house for any evidence of Jacob. So, on the 28th of July in 2015, investigators found duct tape and handcuffs in his kitchen drawer. They also found 4 bins full of boys' clothing and so many VHS tapes from over a decade. And on these VHS tapes, they found that they were all filmed by Heinrich, and they were all filmed of young boys doing different things, like bending over or, just lots of different things. They also found 19 binders full of child pornography. 19 binders. And so because of this, he was charged with 25 counts with possession and receipt of child pornography. So Heinrich spent almost a year in jail waiting for his trial date, and then 3 weeks before his trial date, his lawyers came up with the literal shittiest, most frustrating plea deal I've ever heard in my entire life. So basically, if he confesses to abducting and murdering Jacob and shows investigators where Jacob's remains are, that he doesn't get charged for that at all. and walks away with one charge of child pornography, which carries a maximum sentence of 17 to 20 years. Like, I'm sorry, but I just don't understand how that's fair. I guess at this stage for the Wetterlings, because the Wetterlings agreed to it, that it must have just been, they just wanted closure and they just wanted to be able to bury him, I guess, and know where his remains are. But it's still so frustrating. Heinrich's confession was incredibly detailed and it made the case all that much more sad if it wasn't already sad enough. And it didn't just make it sad in terms of, what happened or the fact that he got literally the shittest plea deal ever, but it was also sad in terms of the fact that all the Wetterlings' hope that they had over the past 27 years was just crushed just like that. And something that I learned while researching this case, which is so incredibly sad, is that every single year, Patty and Jerry lit a candle on a cupcake for Jacob's birthday in the hopes that one day he would be able to come home and blow it out. And they also always left a light on for him. So in Heinrich's confession, he basically spoke about how on the night of the abduction, he drove around St. Joseph's aimlessly with no rhyme or reason. He ended up driving down the dead-end road that led to the Wetterlings' house, and in doing so, he saw 3 boys making their way into town. So he decided to park right near the gravel driveway and just wait for them to come back. He said when the boys got back, just like Trevor and Aaron had described, he got out of the car, he walked towards them, and he told them to put their bikes in the ditch, and he told them to get in the ditch themselves, face down. He said that he handcuffed Jacob and put him in the front passenger seat of his car and drove away, and that while he was driving away, Jacob was crying and asking, "What did I do wrong?" Heinrich had a police scanner in his car, which he started to hear a bit of activity on, so he told Jacob kind of to, lean down in the passenger seat so that nobody would see him, and he just drove around St. Joseph's for a while until eventually heading back to Painesville, which is where he lived. He pulled off on a side road near a gravel pit and he told Jacob to get out of the car. He took the handcuffs off and he told Jacob to undress and to start touching himself. He then sexually assaulted Jacob, and Jacob started to cry and he said he was cold and that he just wanted to go home. So Heinrich told him to just get dressed. He said that shortly after this happened, he saw a patrol car drive by, and this patrol car actually wasn't for him, but he thought that it was and he panicked. So he told Jacob to turn around and then he shot him. Although the gun actually jammed and it didn't go off, which I just cannot imagine how scared Jacob would have been and what he must have been feeling when that gun didn't go off. But then he did it a second time and Jacob fell to the floor. I guess, as the family, you would want closure, but in this case, I just feel like it's so much more horrific knowing exactly what he went through at the end of his life. So Heinrich actually ended up leaving Jacob's body there, and he went home where he stayed for a few hours before going back and walking back to the location where Jacob's body was with a shovel. He tried digging a hole to bury Jacob with his shovel, but it turned out to be too small, so he walked to a nearby construction site. He took a bobcat and drove it over to where Jacob's body was, which he then used to dig the hole, bury Jacob's body in it, which he then returned to the construction site, and then he went back to Jacob's body and tried to, just cover it with a little bit of grass and stuff. He then realized that he forgot to bury Jacob's shoes, so he just went and threw them in a nearby ravine, and then he went home, and that was it for him. And then he returned for some reason about a year later and decided to move his body. So he moved it to a nearby cow pasture and buried it in a hole about 2 feet deep, which is where he ended up leading investigators to when he did tell them that he would lead them to the remains. So when investigators went to go and see the remains, they brought a metal detector because Jacob was wearing a red jacket with metal buttons on it the night that he died. And this red jacket was everywhere. It was what they told people to look for because it was one of the most identifiable pieces of clothing because it was red. And so they brought this to look for it, to find out exactly where he buried the body, and they didn't end up having to use it at all, because the whole time, for 27 years, there was a little piece of red fabric sticking out of the grass, out of the ground at the cow pasture, which it was just there in plain sight the whole time, and nobody found him. So that is the end of this case. Of course, if there are any details that I forgot, as always, make sure to leave them in the description below for anyone else to see. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the case, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys.